I'm Kenneth Slowick. I'm a curator of musical instruments at the National Museum of American History, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Selection Committee to this ceremony in honor of and lecture by the winner of the 2021, delayed by the pandemic, sorry to say, Distinguished Scholar in the Sciences. That is Janine L. Brown, who is a senior scientist and head of the endocrinology laboratory within the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute's Center for Species Survival at Front Royal. The honor of the Distinguished Scholar Award was originally entitled the Smithsonian Secretary's Distinguished Research Lecture Award, even more of a mouthful than it is now, and it's been given 24 times since its inception in the year 2000. Nominations are made by peers of those nominated, that is to say, the curatorial and research staffs of the various bureaus, and the nominations are supported by letters from outside academic adjudicators, plus by full listings of the nominees' scholarly output. The Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award highlights the Smithsonian's commitment to knowledge derived through historical inquiry, the scientific method, rigorous analysis and peer review, and the syntheses that can result from a broad understanding of a particular culture or period. People trust the Smithsonian to care for Americans' treasures and pursue and share historical, cultural, and scientific truth. Because of that trust, it's important that we uphold our founding principles and James Smithson's mandate to increase and diffuse knowledge. To further these longstanding institutional commitments, in 2017, then Secretary David Skorton added to the annual award a second annual award so that each year sustained achievement at the Smithsonian in both the sciences and the humanities is acknowledged. Though the pandemic has played havoc with the regular presentation of these awards, they, together with the Secretary's research prizes and the research tent at the annual staff picnic, offer Smithsonian employees, members of Congress, and the public several opportunities each year to learn about the remarkable work that takes place at the institution. Each of these events showcases Smithsonian scholars and the new and innovative ways they are sharing knowledge with the world. The criteria for this particular award are outstanding and sustained achievement in research, so rather different than the research prizes, which could be given for excellence in, say, one publication or book. This is a longer arching achievement. Long-standing commitment to the Smithsonian, so most of that work should have been done at the Smithsonian rather than someone who's worked elsewhere and has just made an appearance here. And then the ability to communicate to both a specialist and a non-specialist audience. I'd like to thank my colleagues of the selection committee, which is comprised of previous winners of the award, who were active in this round's review process. Louise Court from Freer-Sackler, David Dvorkin from NASM, Giovanni Fazio from the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, William Foreman, ditto, Paula Johnson, my colleague at American History, Christine Jones, also from SAO, Nancy Knowlton from the Natural History Museum, Christine Mullen-Kramer from the National Museum of African Art, Igor Krupnik, again from Natural History, Michael Neufeld from Air and Space, Fernando Santos Granero from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Center in Panama, and Tom Waters from the Air and Space Museum's Center for Earth and Planetary Studies. So you can see that there's been a wide range of activities that are represented here by previous awardees. To review the nominations, I think my fellow committee members will agree, is both an enlightening and a rather humbling experience. Enlightening because one learns, at least in a broad sense, of many research projects, some of them quite long-spanning, which illustrate the breadth and diversity of our collective mission of advancing the increase and diffusion of knowledge. And humbling because each of the nominees is obviously an important figure in his or her field. We are honored to work alongside such distinguished colleagues who, through their work, uphold the Smithsonian's deserved reputation for excellence. Before we hear Dr. Brown's presentation today, which is entitled My Journey with the Elephants, Integrating Science and Management, Secretary Lonnie Bunch has some observations on the importance of research at the Smithsonian in these rather perilous times.
Ken, thank you for those comments. And I got to tell you, this is one of the things I love to do. As secretary, one of the joys is that you get to really engage with the amazing research that's being done throughout the organization. And it gives me a chance to remember that I was once a historian, did honest work. Now I shake hands. So for me, this is an opportunity to sort of celebrate what the Smithsonian is. And when I think about this Distinguished Scholar Award, it's recognized, as Ken said, for scholarship in our community, really an award since 2000. Because the Smithsonian has such a worthy number of recipients that, as Ken mentioned, we do both a humanities and a scientific award. But when I think about this, I was looking at the early years of this, and I can't help but think about the first recipient, Dr. Margaret Geller, who was a senior astrophysics at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. Her work is so well regarded among her colleagues that the Spanish astrophysical community recently named an entire space with a public telescope after her. It was really recognition how globally the work we do matters, and it's a testament to the scholarship at the Smithsonian. And I have to tell you, today's honoree is worthy of all of our acclaim and recognition because she has done such important work. It is my great honor today to present this long overdue award to Dr. Janine Brown. I had the privilege of going out to SCBI and spending time with her last month. And I'm going to tell you, I was so impressed both by the depth of her expertise, but also by her unbridled passion for science and to use science for the greater good. For me, that is part of what we do at the Smithsonian. We do amazing research, but it's also about the greater good. And as many of you know, Dr. Brown is a senior scientist and the head of the endocrinology, and I can never say that word. You know what she's the head of. And that, to be honest, her research has really been crucially important. It's helped us particularly in the area of management and conservation of endangered species, especially elephants. But I've been so impressed as I was sitting listening to her last month talk about these techniques that she's developed to measure hormone levels and other biomarkers across dozens of species and amass extensive and invaluable data. In some ways, isn't that the strength of the Smithsonian, that we can do long-term research and provide that view onto the research we're doing? And in some ways, the work that she has done has really expanded and really helped us understand how we can be much more involved and engaged in biological conservation. From her laboratory at Front Royal, she has really been a global voice on elephant reproductive biology, and her work informs, I think, the management plans for Asian and African elephants, both in the United States and globally. I was also quite taken listening to her talk about her commitment to graduate students and postdoctoral fellows and interns working in her field. She recognizes that part of her job is to ensure mentorship of the next generation and to make sure that she's shaping both their character, but also their scientific vision. When I first met Dr. Brown, I got to experience the joy she has for her work. It's a reminder to me of how important cutting-edge research like this is to the Smithsonian. Because think about it, over the last 176 years, we have constantly been at our best when we marry our commitment to research with taking on important elements, important topics that can be transformative, that like this research that she's been doing. Since its founding, the Smithsonian has been a reservoir of knowledge for people to dip into and to live their lives and improve their lives. Our scholarship is what allows the Smithsonian not just to share knowledge with the world, but to actively amass it. It's what makes this a living, breathing institution that not only preserves history, but makes history. And in some ways, what I'm so excited about is that this is an opportunity today for us to hear from one of our gifted colleagues. And so it is my great honor to welcome her to the stage so I can present her with the medal for the Smithsonian's Distinguished Scholar in the Sciences for 2021. So come on down.
Hi, everyone. See if I can forward this. Okay. Yeah, and thank you so much, Secretary Bunch. I'm incredibly honored to receive this award and quite humbled, actually. It's hard to find the words to say how grateful I am to everyone. But I would like to thank the selection committee. I would like to thank my wonderful boss, Nucharan Songsasan, and my fantastic colleague, Buddha Pukarenthi, who nominated me for this award. And then, of course, all the people that wrote supporting letters. I am just extremely grateful for all of their support. And so I really do appreciate, I guess, the opportunity to tell you a little bit about my 35-year journey with elephants, which is a scary number, 35 years, that's a long time. But it has been a really fun ride for me. And I consider myself a basic scientist, so we're always very interested in the basic biology of species, but at the end of the day, we always hope that our work has some meaning in terms of improving the life and the well-being of the animals in our care. And so that's what I try to do for all of our species, but maybe the elephants in particular. And so, yeah, Secretary Bunch, he kind of gave the first part of my presentation. So I do, in fact, run the endocrine lab out in Front Royal. I've been there since 1991 when it was known as the Conservation and Research Center. You can see we've changed our name a couple of times. Each time we change the name, it gets a little longer. I think one more change, I might not be able to remember all the letters. So keep in mind, Brandy. So I am a comparative biologist, and within our lab, our goal for each species is to use endocrinology to better understand their biology and use that information to aid conservation and management. And so we do that by conducting the basic research. Things like, when does reproduction start? When does it stop? Is it seasonal? What other factors affect it? And how are the hormone processes associated with health and welfare? And so we'll gather all of that information on a species, and then once we have that normative data, we can then apply it in a way that can be helpful for better management and population sustainability. So we can diagnose and treat fertility problems. We try to mitigate stress and improve welfare. And then we work with the gamete biologist enough to aid in the use of development of assisted reproductive techniques like artificial insemination and embryo transfer, because a lot of those methods have an endocrine component. So as Secretary Bunch mentioned, yeah, the reason we've been so successful, I think, is because we've developed assay techniques to measure hormones in a variety of different sample types. So we can do it not only in blood, which is sort of the gold standard, and it's what most other people that are working on reproduction will collect, but it's not very practical for a lot of wildlife species. So we can measure hormones secreted in saliva or deposited in hair, or our most popular approach is looking at it excreted in urine and feces. And so what we like to think in our lab is that no matter what the research question is, or no matter what the management problem could be, if they think it has an endocrine component, we're going to be able to study it because we have all the pieces of the puzzle in play. So we have used that approach to assess, and we've amassed endocrine data on more than 100 species that we have then been able to adapt to improving management and making an impact on aiding population sustainability. So I could spend a week telling you all about these different stories, because I have lots and lots of stories. But today is actually going to be all about elephants. And so anybody that knows me knows that I am passionate, if not maybe a little obsessed with elephants. From the first study that I was asked to help with an elephant project, it wasn't even my project to begin with, I just sort of got hooked, and it was like the light bulb went off in my head, and it was like, this is where I need to be. These species are so fascinating, I just want to learn more about them. And so, while my work still is very comparative, I will say that the elephants are what are in my head all the time. But then I didn't really start out to be an elephant biologist. That was a very opportunistic thing that came to me. When I was actually an assistant professor up the street in Maryland at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. So I was in the OBGYN department, and my project was to look at hormonal processes responsible for testicular development and growth. And so working on that, all of a sudden I got a call in the lab from John Lenhart, who was the curator of elephants at the National Zoo, and he says, "Can you measure hormones in elephants?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't know, but it sounds kind of interesting." So he had this young female, Shanti, she was about 14 years of age, and he wanted to know if she was pubertal or not. So I went to the library. We didn't have Google. I went to the library, and I found one paper that said the cycle length was 3 weeks based on urinary estrogens. I found another, I think it was an abstract, that said it was 3 months based on serum progesterone. Well, with all of my training, I figured that the progesterone was probably the way to go, and so that was the technique that we chose. And we started collecting blood from Shanti twice a week, and we were going to go for 1.5 years. It was just going to be 1.5 years, and then that was the end. And so we did that. And we found that she was, in fact, cycling. If you can see these black dots, each one of these represents an ovarian cycle. This is serum progesterone. And so they last about 3 months, and it meant that Shanti had reached puberty. So the idea was then to send her up to New York for breeding. And so I thought, well, we don't know that much about pregnancy. Why don't we keep going? We should keep collecting samples. And so they did. And so we monitored a pregnancy. You can see it took her about 1 year to get pregnant up in Syracuse. And then she finally did. And then you can see how the progesterone is very, very high. And the pregnancies last about 20 to 22 months, so very long. And then when we were done, I thought, well, let's see how long it takes her to cycle back again. You know, what's her lactational anestrus period? And so, you know, by the time we kept doing this, it was like one question after the next. And then I said, we should look at all the samples you collected from the other elephants that we had at the zoo. And in this case, our African elephant, Nancy, was not cycling at all. And we had no idea what that meant. So we went back to the lab, developed a few more assay techniques, and discovered that she was hyperprolactinemic, which means she produces a lot of prolactin. It's a common cause of infertility in women. And so that seemed to be the case for Nancy. And I'll talk a little bit about these flatliners later. We call them flatliners because the progesterone doesn't change. So I wrote a paper on that, and then all of a sudden we started getting calls from other zoos that wanted us to do the similar hormone monitoring because they were very interested in identifying their fertile females and starting to get interested in breeding programs. And so there was kind of a shift in the way zoos were thinking in the early 90s, and that was that we should be breeding our own elephants rather than always relying on importing from range countries. And so we were really at the forefront of that, and we were the ones really pushing it, that if you want to breed, what you got to do is you got to do hormone monitoring, and it's easy to do hormone monitoring if you can collect blood samples. I think they started calling me Vampira because every meeting I would say, you got to blood sample your elephants, you got to blood sample your elephants. That's the only way you're going to be successful. And so the AZA listened to us, and they put that in the regulations, the requirements that all reproductive aged females have to be hormonally monitored. So we got a lot of business early on and essentially developed the first wildlife endocrine diagnostic lab. So it started out just for elephants, but obviously we've morphed it into working on a whole lot of other species. And we also developed the non-invasive tests because we didn't want to give any zoos an excuse not to do hormone monitoring. So the early years were really fun for me. They were very exploratory. You know, the data were kind of descriptive, and it just seemed like we were learning things every year. And so I'm gonna give you a quick biology background on endocrine function in elephants. And I love using this profile because this is a female at the Oregon Zoo that kind of shows everything that we're going to see in a hormone profile. So the first one is she reached puberty at a very young age, 5 years of age. We honestly thought elephants weren't reaching puberty until 12 to 14 years of age. That's why John Lenhart thought maybe at 14 she's reached puberty. Well, now we know they're reaching puberty really young, which has a management implication because you don't want bulls breeding these little young females. And there were a couple of accidents in Western zoos and they did not end well. So our recommendation to all zoos, if you have a young calf, you need to start monitoring her at about 4 years of age. And so that's what we do. And then we have analyzed literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of ovarian cycles. Again, this is serum progesterone, and these are these kind of 3 to 4 month cycles. And these are also the longest cycle of any mammal that we know of. Although interestingly, within a female, the cycle lengths are actually pretty consistent. But you can see they have a pretty wide range across the different individuals. So we do a lot of hormone monitoring. When you see an animal cycling like this, it means she's very fertile. And she would be a good candidate for breeding. And then we do a lot of pregnancy diagnosis, obviously, in the lab. And their gestation is also very long, 20 to 22 months, also the longest of any other mammal that we know of. And then we like to do the postpartum and estrus to get a sense of when she starts cycling back, and that gives an indication of when she's fertile again and can be rebred. And so I think this may be the most sciencey thing I'm going to give you, but we developed a model of the elephant ovarian cycle because it is quite different in being so long. And so what we find, this is the progesterone, we find that the luteal phase, which is the phase where progesterone is predominant, is between 8 and 10 weeks long. Then when we look at the follicular phase, it's also very, very long compared to other species. Most other species, the follicular phase is like 3 to 7 days or something like that. And in the elephant, they have 2 follicular waves during about a 6-week follicular phase. So they've got a lot of time to do stuff. And so what they decided to do is have 2 waves of follicles growing. And the interesting thing is when follicles grow, they produce estrogen. And when estrogen reaches a peak, it triggers an LH surge. And the LH surge is what triggers ovulation. Well, then the elephants, they decided to have 2 LH surges. The first one did not cause ovulation. The second one did. But these are occurring pretty consistently at 3 weeks apart. So there's something different going on between these first and second waves. We did a little bit more hormonal testing and whatnot, and we looked at FSH, which is a hormone important for stimulating follicles, and we looked at inhibin, which is another hormone that's in the granulosa cells, blah, blah, blah. And what we see is that the hormonal milieu between the first and the second wave is actually quite different. So in other mammals, when ovulation, when you do dominant follicle selection, it should occur when FSH is declining and inhibin is increasing. And you can see it's just the opposite at this first surge. So that's why the first wave does not result in ovulation. So, okay, very sciencey. The main thing that I love about this finding, is that it had became very key to developing artificial insemination for elephants. So we started this back in 1994, and people actually had been trying it for at least 10 years before this, and they had not had success. And there are 2 main challenges for doing AI in elephants. Number one, the reproductive tract is really, really long. It's like 3 meters long, and to get a flexible semen catheter up, take a bend, impossible. It just couldn't be done. So we teamed up with a team of veterinarians from Germany. Thomas and Frank, we call them the Berlin Boys, and they developed a 2-part catheterization system. So they had a thick balloon catheter that went in first, and then you could thread the flexible endoscope through that with the semen catheter. And so our elephant Shanti was the guinea pig for all of this, and so she contributed heavily to the development of AI. And then the other key was, when do you do the insemination? Because these cycles are 3 to 4, months long, and yet they're only fertile for maybe 2 days a cycle. So that's where the double LH surge came in. And now all we have to do is take blood samples when the progesterone comes to baseline. You find this first surge right here. You find that first surge. You know she's going to ovulate in about 3 weeks. that's when you rally everybody to come in and do the AI. And so we're still doing it this way, almost exactly this way today, and our lab is responsible for the majority of the LH analyses. And then this is kind of fun. I always say this is a gift that elephants gave us. So during the last bit of gestation, we'll start collecting daily blood samples, because what we've learned is the progesterone, which is the pregnancy hormone, comes down to baseline before she gives birth. You know, most mammals, the progesterone crashes and then they give birth. Well, she doesn't give birth for several days after. So what we do is we call them birth watches, which Steve takes care of a lot of these, every day. And when we see the progesterone drop, you can call the zoo and say, you're gonna have a baby in just a few days. And that gets everybody going. So in this particular profile, this is Andre Gomez. He was the technician at the time we were doing this. This was Shanti's pregnancy. And so he called me on Thanksgiving Day. So that kind of ruined a turkey day. We did all these phone trees and got everybody ready. I packed my bag and I went down to the zoo and I got to see the miracle of the birth of Condola, which was pretty amazing. And I would say that we'd worked so hard for this, and I kind of thought that if I never did anything ever again, or if I died tomorrow, I would be very happy. You know, this was a pretty big push that a large number of people worked together to do, and we're still able to do this now. We figure probably the majority, definitely the majority of African elephants and a good proportion of Asian elephants are produced by artificial insemination yet today. Okay, and then we keep going. So I'm a very visual person, and I like this profile because it shows like 20 years of ovarian cycles, and you want to see elephants cycling. I mean, this means that they're healthy and that they're fertile. This was our oldest elephant, Ambika, and you can see she cycled beautifully into her 60s, but then it became a problem. And what we noted was she had severe anemia that was linked to reproductive tract pathologies, and she had a lot of blood in her reproductive tract. And so what we now know, again, kind of from the Berlin boys, is that when elephants cycle all the time, and especially when they get out in an older age group and they have not had a pregnancy, they start to develop these cysts and tumors. And we think it's due to continuous exposure to ovarian steroids, because in the wild, elephants are usually pregnant or lactating, and so they don't actually have that many cycles in their lifetime. But in captivity, if we're not regularly breeding elephants, we can develop these problems. So I went to my major professor, my PhD major professor, and I knew he was working with a company to develop a GnRH vaccine. And so how that works is you give the vaccine, the female develops antibodies against the GnRH, which is the hormone responsible for stimulating the pituitary to release the LH and FSH, which is important for follicular development and estrus and all that stuff. And so you block that. The antibodies will block GnRH, that blocks LH and FSH, and then that blocks the production of the estrogens that are thought to be the main culprit in developing these tumors. So we tried that in Ambika, and it worked beautifully. And so we see an increase in GnRH antibody titers. Her cycles completely flatlined, and the pathologies regressed. And so this treatment literally saved her life. She lived another 13 years and was very healthy until the end. And we're doing this now for a lot of older females within North America. We're kind of the go-to lab to help with this. And I just got back from a trip to India, and they were asking me to help with one of their elephants that had some reproductive tract pathologies. So we're starting to use this more globally. Okay, so then you sometimes take one step forward and 2 steps back, maybe, and this was one of my 2 steps back findings. We're going back to Nancy, that was a flatliner, and we just thought she was a one-off, that, yeah, she was just different from everybody else. But when we had the endocrine service lab, where we were getting samples from hundreds of elephants coming in every year, we noted that she was not a one-off, and that about 20% of Asian elephants and 40% of African elephants were not cycling normally. The Asian elephants didn't scare us too much because a lot of those were older. We don't think elephants have menopause, but at least reproduction can slow down as you get older, and those were non-breeding aged females. The Africans were more of a concern because the flatlining was occurring throughout all of the different age groups, and so you can't breed an elephant if she's not cycling. So this took me down like a 10-year rabbit hole trying to find out what is causing this problem. We looked at all the different hormonal mechanisms associated with infertility in women and domestic livestock, and we just couldn't find anything that stuck. You know, it didn't seem to be stress. My PhD was cystic ovarian disease in dairy cattle, not a problem with elephants. We looked at other hormones in the gonads. We looked at metabolic function with thyroids. We looked at how the pituitary responded to GnRH. Even used anti-Mullerian hormone, which is a test they give to women to see if they've entered menopause. Because I was thinking maybe these elephants were entering an early menopause. No, that wasn't it either. And then we did have Nancy that was hyperprolactinemia. We've only seen this in African elephants, and you know, it's a kind of a small, well, not a small proportion, but it's certainly not occurring in all of the African elephants. And we could not find a cause of hyperprolactinemia based on the usual suspects. And so there is something going on that's causing this that doesn't seem to have a central primary endocrine component. And then after several talks that I gave, I would have always somebody in the audience say, well, does it happen in the wild? And so we decided to do a field study, and we collected fecal samples from free-ranging female African elephants in Addo Elephant National Park. Elizabeth Freeman worked on this project along with our intern, Jordana Meyer, and we had elephants all across different age categories. I think we had like 60 elephants. We did not see acyclicity as a major problem with these wild elephants. So we circle back then and wonder, okay, is it perhaps related to management? Is there something in the way we're managing these elephants that we're not supporting good ovarian development? And so it started to be, rather than looking at reproduction just by itself, maybe we should be using it as a proxy for general welfare, so that if we can identify management conditions that support welfare, we might have a positive effect on reproduction. So this was kind of a complete paradigm shift for me in my thinking of how to approach this problem, because it was a really big problem. So we teamed up with 6 other PIs and got a $1 million grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to conduct the largest elephant welfare study ever conducted to date. So we had 255 elephants. We had all but 2 AZA zoos that participated in the study, and PIs with differing expertise. So we had veterinarians that knew about foot and joint problems. We had behaviorists that looked at this abnormal stereotypic behaviors. We were already invested in looking at obesity in elephants, and of course the ovarian acyclicity issue. So we were really hoping that if we could do this big, large, kind of an epidemiological type study, we could maybe pin down what the risk factors were for these problems, and including the ovarian acyclicity, because I really wanted to know what was going on with that. So this is kind of what the model looked like, a multivariable model. We did behavioral observations and management surveys. So all the things in the circles are your inputs. So those are all the things that we measured within the captive environment that the elephant was exposed to. And then we modeled those against our welfare outcomes, which are in squares. And so, you know, if you look, how does predictable, let's see. How does predictability of feedings, training, number of feedings, how does that affect body condition? You know, how does space, transfers, staff interaction, how do they affect stereotypy? So we wanted to do this multivariable modeling to try to get to those answers. And then our lab was responsible for all the hormonal assessments in blood and fecal samples that had been collected every other or twice a week for a year. We had more than a dozen hormones that we were looking at, and this was again my Steve Paris, who ran all the hormones in this. I was so afraid I was going to break you, and I'm so glad I didn't break you. And he is still with me, so we're good. I think we're good. But yeah, and I can't get through all of these, but we really tried to look at all of the different physiological, functions that we could to get a handle on what was good or bad for welfare in these animals. So just quickly, some of the things that we found, some of the major things that we found when we looked at health. And again, I had been really interested in body condition and metabolism when I'd been traveling overseas, and I would see animals in the wild, and then I would come home and like, our elephants are so fat. And so what does that mean? And so we already had indication that being overweight, we developed a body condition scoring system from 1 to 5. So 4s and 5s are overweight or obese. And you can see that we had the majority of our elephants were overweight or obese. And so we knew from before, and we just finalized, supported the fact that these really fat elephants have some abnormal metabolic function. They also show signs of ovarian cycle problems and lipid panels. And then we measured leptin, which is a hormone produced in fat cells, and it's associated with obesity in women. So we did show a positive correlation between the leptin and rates of obesity in our elephants. So we know that we're looking at a true obesity kind of crisis. But exercise, not surprising, is good for body condition and metabolic health. And so this is something that, we're really encouraging all zoos to try to get these elephants as much exercise as possible. And we can do that through encouraging walking distances. And a couple of ways to do that is in the way you feed them. So you give them a diversity of different ways to feed them. You might hang it in food. You might hide it in a log. You might put it in a timed feeder that lets food out at different times. You want the elephants to be kind of seeking and searching throughout the exhibit to look for its food, like it would do in the wild. And that was related to better body condition and actually ovarian cyclicity. So whether an elephant lies down or not is also a good welfare indicator. If they don't lie down, it can suggest that something is not quite right. And so none of us like to sleep on concrete, right? So elephants don't really like it either. If they have health problems, they're less likely to lie down. And if they think their herd mates are going to hassle them while they're trying to sleep, they're probably not. So if, it's just another indicator. If you see this happening in your herd, you might want to go in and take a harder look at what might be causing the reason why elephants aren't lying down. And there may be one of these causes. And then foot and joint health, these hard surfaces, they're going to come up multiple times. Not very good for not many things. So then stereotypic behavior, this is probably one of the best behavioral indicators that an animal has poor welfare. It develops when they're frustrated, when they're bored, when they just have poor welfare conditions that do not meet physical or mental needs. And they're honestly really hard to look at. They probably act as a self-soothing behavior, because if you do this, you're kind of self-soothing, but you're doing it because things aren't quite right with you. So our goal is to really try to find ways of reducing stereotypic behavior. So in our big IMLS study, a lot of interzoo, if an elephant had a lot of interzoo transfers, they had an increased risk. When they're housed separately, they also had an increased risk, which isn't surprising because they're lonely and bored probably. Whereas if they're in larger groups, if they're housed with juveniles, and if they have positive interactions with keepers, you're going to see a decreased risk of stereotypic behavior. And this all kind of fits into the social nature of elephants that can be social with other elephants and with people as well. And then enrichment, giving them things to do, keeping them occupied. That is so important to welfare. And giving them some choice and control, we say. So if the elephant can decide, I want to be outside now, he can actually go outside, and he doesn't have to wait for a keeper to let him outside. So choice and control is really important. For ovarian cyclicity, here we are. Enrichment diversity and feeding diversity was associated with elephants that were cycling normally. So promoting normal behaviors can enhance physiological function. When we looked at social factors, which I think are probably the key factor in terms of welfare and reproduction in elephants, when they're in normal mixed sex herds with bulls and cows and calves, and they have a positive social experience with lots of elephants that are socially compatible, this is where you're going to have the best reproduction. Experience even one pregnancy is a positive effect, and we call it use it or lose it. So we do like to say you want to breed your elephant fairly early and keep them reproductive throughout their lifetime so they don't lose it. And then housing alone, not a good thing with elephants because they are extremely social. Zoos today AZA I don't believe will accredit a zoo that only has one elephant, and so we're really getting away from this. So multi-generational herd with calves and bulls spending more time in socially compatible groups, I think that's the key to good welfare and certainly to reproduction. Looking at the stress hormone, glucocorticoids, which can include corticosterone and cortisol. Again, time alone, time on hard surfaces, poor joint health. We all know those are bad, and they're associated with higher levels of stress hormones. Choice and control, exercise, positive physical contact, lower stress hormone levels. And so these all kind of tie in with our other welfare measures as well. So a lot of these same factors are popping up in the different ways. And so in terms of positive physical contact, one of my favorite, I guess maybe I'm really proud of this paper that came out of the IMLS study that showed good relationships are key to welfare. And these relationships are reciprocal. So they're reciprocal between the elephant and the keeper. So that keepers that had strong bonds with their elephants expressed better job satisfaction, and their elephants had lower cortisol. Elephants that had positive interactions with people and other elephants had lower cortisol. So social bonding is extremely important between elephant and elephant and people. And I'll just point out that this picture at the top is my son, Remy, coming to visit our elephant, Shanti, at the zoo. Our elephants, especially the original 4 girls, were always very, very social, and they just seemed to love to hang out with us, and I loved to hang out with them and the keepers. And so you would get tired or maybe even a little depressed, and what am I doing here? I don't know if I'm making a difference. And so you would go down to the zoo and literally spend a couple hours with the elephants and feel so much better. The batteries are recharged, you're ready to kill it again. And we in the lab called it QET, which is our quality elephant time. And so whenever people would just get a little bit, we need some more quality elephant time, and so we would go down to the zoo. So for us, it was definitely reciprocal. So lots of things related to good welfare that we've talked about, and zoos are jumping all over these and making a lot of changes based on these recommendations. One of the interesting things we found was that it didn't seem to be like the total space of the exhibit, like the size of the exhibit that was important, but rather how complex that exhibit is, how much is there for them to do, how socialized are the elephants within that exhibit. And so when people tell you, oh, you can't have elephants because you don't have enough space, I'm not sure that's quite the right way to go about it. So then if I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about my parallel life in Thailand. I consider Thailand my second home. I've been working there for over 20 years. And they just have so many similar situations there that we do here. They have about 3,000 captive elephants in Thailand. They work they're very important culturally, so they are the national symbol of Thailand. They're important religiously. They are important economically because elephant tourism, they are the epicenter of elephant tourism. And so there's a lot of money that comes in from tourism. And there's a lot of questions about whether tourism is good for elephants or not. And there are about 3,000 elephants in the wild as well. Now, when I first started going to Thailand, it was actually 2002 that I went there the first time, and I met the dean of the vet school at Chiang Mai University up in the north, and he comes up and I hear this thing again. I hear you're an endocrinologist. Can you help us set up an endocrine lab? And so that's really how I got started in Thailand. They were worried about reproductive rates of their captive elephants. They knew what we had been doing in the U.S. We'd been doing it in the U.S. for about 10 years. And so I sort of transferred all of my knowledge over there, and we started doing some similar studies. But then, same thing in the U.S. We had kind of a shift in our thinking away from just looking at reproduction and focusing it on holistic welfare, because I was convinced that it wasn't really the specific reproduction thing, that it was a welfare thing. And so there are a lot of criticisms of elephant tourism as well. Animal rights groups, the hook is bad, chains are bad, riding is definitely bad. And I will give them some credit to bringing this to the forefront and having people talk about how they're managing elephants in Asia, but the problem is they were making all of these statements with absolutely no supportive data whatsoever. There was no empirical evidence necessarily that any of these things were bad. And so we thought, as scientists, we would try to do a similar elephant welfare study in Thailand, sort of mimicking what we had done in the United States. And let's try to find out what these factors are doing. And if they are causing problems, then what we need to do is figure out how to fix it. So we did, our study was maybe twice the number of elephants that were in the US study, focused in the northern part of Thailand, which is sort of the epicenter of tourism in Thailand, and Thailand's the epicenter of tourism in the world. So we did the same things with surveys, collecting blood and fecal samples, got an idea of what elephants were doing every day, and then we did a modeling, same kind of modeling. So all of the factors in the squares, those were our input variables of what was going on in the captive environment. And then we modeled those against our elephant welfare outcomes, which are in blue. So like physical outcomes included wound and foot scores and body condition score. Physiological outcomes included our stress hormone, glucocorticoids, and also our metabolic function to look at obesity. So we then did a survey of what elephants were being used for in the camps. So you could see out of 33 camps, they were all letting tourists feed them treats. And a lot of these were bananas and sugarcane, which you will see later, I think, is not a good idea. Elephant bathing's popular. Riding with a saddle or a bareback is also in about half of these camps. So they have a wide variety of different kinds of activities that we could then model against these different welfare inputs. And so in general, the survey showed, so in the US, if you remember, 76% of our elephants were overweight or obese. In Thailand, not so bad, 50%, but that's still a lot of overweight and obese elephants. They did have some foot problems, not too different from what we see in zoos. Some of them had skin wounds, primarily due to Angus abuse, which I will talk about. We didn't see that many saddle lesions, wounds caused by the saddle, and that's because there was a study conducted several years ago that showed a risk factor for lesions was using rice sacks under the saddle. So the camps don't use rice sacks anymore, and that solved the problem. And so that's where using science to kind of solve problems is where we want to go. They do have a similar rate of stereotypic behavior than we do in the United States. Although over the years we've done a lot of projects on progesterone and looking at ovarian cycling, and that seems to be less of a problem in Thailand. So we really are just sort of honed in on just looking at the welfare issue of these animals. And so the riding that's probably the elephant in the room. I mean, this is the thing that the animal rights groups are the most vocal about that should be stopped. I'm not saying I'm a proponent of riding, but we had more than half of the camps in our study that were offering riding 6.5 hours a day or so. What we found was those that gave riding actually had better body condition. They were not in the overweight or obese categories. They also had better metabolic health when we looked at glucose, insulin, and lipids. They had lower stress hormone concentrations, and they were less bored. So say what you will about riding, the science doesn't support that the act itself is bad. And we even did a gait assessment study because there were reports that, elephants aren't built to carry people and that it's harmful for their back and for their gait. And so we decided to do a gait study. So we used these 3D inertial measurement units that we taped to the side of the elephant, and then we had a special camera, and we would walk them back and forth across this camera, and we would capture their joint kinematics, and found there were no differences in elephants that were carrying up to 15% of their body weight, which is huge, as compared to the ones that just had a mahout. So at least in the short term, we really weren't able to prove that the riding was harming their skeletal structure, at least in the short term. So, to ride or not to ride, I would say from a scientific standpoint, it's not the riding itself that it's harmful, but I will say that we need to pay more attention to the training and the discipline needing to get these animals to ride. And I think that's what we really ought to be focusing on, and not getting so, hyperventilating over the riding part of it. And if elephants don't give rides, they have to get exercise in other ways. And you have to balance diet and exercise. And you don't want to be, if you just have an observation only elephant, don't have the only tourist activity be feeding them bananas and sugar cane all day, because it's not going to be good in the long term. So looking at chains are a necessity in Asia because very few facilities have enclosures like we do in zoos, and you don't want them wandering into your local villages. The main questions we have with chains is how long are they, and then how long are they being used on an elephant? And we have quite a bit of variability. We have some camps that will only chain them at night, which I think is perfectly fine. Others that will chain them during the day, we're trying to work on that. Some of the chains can be very, very short. Well, we like the camps that are putting their elephants out in the forest on much longer chains. And so we're kind of using those camps as our models to try to convince other camps that they might want to follow these recommendations. And then we also did find higher glucocorticoids with more chaining time. So we are trying to put science behind our observations of chainings and higher rates of stereotypies. And then the ANCUS is also another important tool that's used when you've got elephants in free contact, which means the people and the elephants are sharing the same space. And so they can be very useful as literally as a guide, kind of guiding the elephant where you want it to go, where you want his foot to go, kind of a training tool. And also in cases of safety, if something happens and the elephant gets aggressive, it's an important safety measure. But it can easily be abused, and so those are the issues that we're trying to deal with. And in 27% of the elephants that had mahouts, the keepers, that used ANCUSes, we saw wounds associated, and they were also associated with higher glucocorticoids. So this is another main thing that we're looking at in terms of trying to improve welfare and work with camps to do a little bit better job. And then mahout-elephant relationships, again, and that's especially important when it comes to chaining and ANCUS, because you have a good mahout that knows how to take good care of his elephant, you're gonna have good welfare in that elephant. We're starting to lose a little bit of the mahout culture, and so I think this is something that we're really gonna have to focus on in the future to keep welfare at a high level in these elephants, because a lot of these mahouts are leaving the field to do other things that pay better. And then coming back to socialization, which is sort of my thing, in that the best one, if you had to only pick one thing to do for elephants for welfare, I would pick socialization. And so in Thailand, when I first started 20 years ago, there wasn't much breeding going on, and it was clear why, because they had bulls chained up in a corner somewhere, and then the females were maybe chained up over here, and we're like, you gotta unchain, you gotta let bulls interact with females, you gotta start creating some more natural social herds and whatnot. And the camps that are starting to do that are breeding elephants like rabbits, really. And I would say over the past 5 to 7 years of statistics, the captive population looks pretty stable right now. So it really is almost as simple as just let elephants be together. And it's good for their welfare. And so we've published a lot of, this is just a handful of the papers that we've published, and I show this just to say that what I love working in Thailand is because their PhD students have to publish 3 papers, and their masters have to publish 2, and so they are very, very, very productive. And you don't have to strong-arm them because they know that they aren't gonna graduate it unless they have a paper. So we've gotten a lot of really, really good work out of the students in Thailand. And so in general, what do elephants need? You know, they need a lot of the same things that we need in the US. The only real difference is we're not using chains and a hook in the US because we've gone to protected contact, so they're not needed anymore. But there are a lot of commonalities in the management and husbandry of elephants that we can go. And so, you know, we kind of come to the overall conclusion that even though these 2 areas are so vastly different, there really probably is no one-size-fits-all solution for elephant management, and that there are many, many different ways to handle and manage elephants and, you know, participate in zoos or tourism or whatever. But there are right ways and wrong ways to do it within each of these scenarios. So the next step was to try to turn some of our science into action, and we're lucky to have some really, really good veterinarians that work out of Chiang Mai University that go into the camps all the time, administering health care, but they're also delivering our welfare messages. And so we are slowly, slowly starting to see some real improvements in how they're approaching this in terms of chaining and ANCUSes. And some of the camps were actually giving the tourists fodder to feed the elephants rather than bananas and sugarcane. And they wanted me to know that, because they knew if I would come in and tell their elephants were fat, they wouldn't be happy. So then in 2015, a group of us from Thailand and other regional Southeast Asian countries got together. We formed the Asian Captive Elephant Working Group with the idea that we wanted to create a set of welfare guidelines that were based on our scientific findings and that might have a broader application to facilities, to tourist facilities, to see if we can improve welfare. So these guidelines are now adapted by the Asian Elephant Specialist Group that have endorsed them. They're going to get a much wider distribution, and it just gives us huge credibility that the IUCN SSC is endorsing our ideas. And then we're also working with a company that's based in Thailand, and a couple of us are working as advisors on it, the Asian Captive Elephant Standards, and they're doing welfare auditing of camps regionally. They had a little bit of a hiccup during COVID, but now they're getting back on track. And so the idea is to do welfare assessments, certify some of these camps. Countries are not necessarily enforcing welfare guidelines, and so what we're hoping is that this will be an economic push, so that if they can put a certification on their website, then tourists, when they're looking for a good camp, will at least see that, and maybe the money will talk, and we'll get more camps involved in this. And so I've seen a lot of improvements in management in terms of all these factors that we've been really worried about. We still have a ways to go, to be honest, but it's nice to see and hear that people are interested in what we have to say, and I think a lot of them are really trying to do their best to do better. I don't know how long I've been talking because I forgot to turn the timer on, but I've just got a few more things that I want to say because we're doing work more than just in Thailand, and so this is another one of my favorite projects that we're doing at the Elephant Conservation Center in Laos. Laos used to be known as the land of 1 million elephants, and now they have maybe 1,000, and they're kind of split between wild and captive, and the captive elephants aren't reproducing well at all. So these are populations that are in serious decline and potential for disappearing. So we're working really closely with their biologist, Annabelle Lopez Perez. She was very interested in breeding the elephants because they hadn't had much luck. They have like 35 females and 8 bull elephants there, I believe. So she wanted an endocrine lab, so we set up an endocrine lab, and she's been tracking the females, and it's just kind of ramped up her ability to do better breeding management. So they've had at least 4 calves born, and I think 2 more females are pregnant. So that part is going really well. But it's not just the reproduction she's interested in. It's kind of just like every other place that I've worked. You know, you start with reproduction, because that's kind of the low-hanging fruit part, but then you want to morph it into welfare. And so she's really, really interested in looking at bull behavior, and as I said, a lot of camps, like to keep bulls separate because they are dangerous, and they're afraid that they can't let them be with other animals. And she's showing very clearly that bulls will socialize very, very well, and they'll socialize with each other, and they'll socialize with females, and then you get breeding. And we saw this in some of those camps that were doing good socialization. So again, I keep circling back to socialization being really key to reproduction and welfare of elephants. But she's also going to put some science behind it and collect blood and fecal samples to look at all these different markers related to reproduction, welfare, nutrition. And I think it's going to be really fun to compare her data in Laos, because they're kept on, I think they have 1,500 hectares, it's like 3,000 acres, of very natural forest. So these animals are in pretty naturalistic environments, and so that's going to be really interesting to compare with your traditional tourist camps. Oh, and I also convinced her, I'm helping to support her to get her PhD at Chiang Mai University in Thailand, because she's just so bright, I couldn't not let her get a PhD. So she's about halfway through. The ECC is also working on a rewilding project. They have 4 elephants that they've released into the Nampui National Park. There's a soft release, so they're still being monitored by their mahouts. This is a really, really collaborative project. So we're doing the fecal collections for the hormones, obviously, but we've got Peter Limegruber's group that's going to help with radio tracking, radio collaring. We have Jesus Maldonado's group that is interested in doing a genetic analysis of the Lao elephant population. So it's just a really great project that's bringing a lot of different people together. A couple more, I promise. I also work in Sri Lanka, and this was a pretty cool project also. I work with Vijita Pereira. He's the veterinarian that runs the Elephant Transit Home in Sri Lanka. That is a place that rehabilitates and releases orphan calves. So orphan calves come in, they keep them for several years until they're healthy enough, and then they put them back out into local national parks, like Utawalaway National Park is like right next door, so a lot of the calves go back. out there. And so we were curious as to, how stressful is that kind of a release with these young calves. So he's getting his PhD at the Royal Veterinary College, but we're supporting the project, and he's also getting hormone training at Chiang Mai University. So again, we've got, all these different groups working together. And here are the data. This was actually even better than I thought it would be. Before release, when you look at the blue, you can see that it's pretty low. And then after they are released, then the pink goes up quite stressed. So a significant stress response in these animals that have been released into the park. But it only lasts for like 17 days. And then they come back to a normal rate. And in fact, it's even a little bit lower. So, this bodes really well, I think, for this project, showing that this is not an enormous stressor in the long term for these calves. But what I'd really like to do is, I need to let Vijitha graduate, but then I want to go through the data and look at when the stress hormones go up, I want to take each individual profile for each elephant and see if we can't forecast that out in the future and see if it is a risk, can we indicate it as a risk factor for how they survive later on, right? Because this project only went for a few months after they were habilitated. So I think, and then you could maybe take fecal glucocorticoid assessments and get a sense of how well an animal is going to respond upon release. So anyway, just some extra stuff we could possibly do. And then last, we were just approached by the University of Malaysia in Sabah to set up an endocrine lab working with their biologist, Farina Othman. And what she's really interested in doing is studying, she's been studying the ecology of Borneo elephants in Sabah that are now having to live in these oil palm plantations because they've completely denuded the land. And so they come in because this is where their food source is. And when they chop the palm trees down, they expose all this really rich carbohydrate pulp. And so these elephants are actually getting really, really fat. So we're interested in the stress, we're interested in the nutrition. And we're also interested in some plantations seem to be a little bit more elephant friendly than others. So, we want to see if there's maybe a compromise we can make to have some better human plantation owner coexistence or elephant coexistence. And then I'm really happy with how all of the labs are communicating. So we have we've set up a number of labs throughout Southeast Asia so that we can look at not only elephants, but other animals of national importance. But what I really like is these labs are all kind of working with each other, interacting with each other, collaborating with each other, and doing, sharing training opportunities and things like that. So, I'm just really pleased that I think all of this work is going to continue way into the long term because we have all of this stuff set up already. And maybe my favorite part of the work that I do has to do with collaborations and networking, so bringing people with different expertise together and across different regions, all kind of working to, try to improve how we study and protect elephants. Everybody kind of has their own little piece. And so, I always used to think that I would train myself out of a job, and I think I was ready for that. But instead, I seem to be training myself into more collaborators because we just seem to have more and more people that want to work in the labs and do the work here. So that's been really gratifying, I have to say. And so I guess I'm going to conclude by saying just how really lucky I feel that I am to have been able to do this work. It is my passion. It is my work. It is my hobby. I love it. And I'm not sure I could have done this work anywhere else but the Smithsonian. So I'm extremely grateful to the Smithsonian, and that's why I am a long-term Smithsonian person, just because it was the perfect place to work. And bear with me for just a few more minutes. I have a lot of people to thank because the work that I've done, no way have I done all this on my own, for sure. So I've had some amazing technicians that have come through the lab that have helped with assay development, training, setting up labs. I'm just so grateful for them in the and Steve and Nikki are actually still with me now. Nikki's been with me, I think, almost from the beginning. And just to say that I'm the absent-minded professor times 10, or maybe times 20. And so they both are just so good at maybe keeping me on track, and they do it in such a thoughtful and maybe protective way. And so I really appreciate you both so much for having my back and keeping me straight. And then I've had a lot of really good graduate students and postdocs working on elephants here in the United States. and also in Asia, all kind of working on little pieces of the puzzle to better understand elephant biology and how that impacts their welfare. And these are my two main collaborators in Thailand that have welcomed me into their country and welcomed me into their homes. Second home, these are my second family. My mentors, Jerry Reeves was my PhD mentor, taught me all things endocrine. Dr. Phil Sanger, he was my master's and he taught me all things reproduction, but he also took a chance on a very shy person with very little self-confidence back then and told me I could do it. And so I'm not sure I'd be here today if it wasn't for him. And he would have been here, but he has some health concerns. Prabir Chakraborty was also a very good mentor, and he also introduced me to Dave Welt, who then did literally change my life when he hired me in 1991 to run the endocrine lab. Shout out to a lot of the funding sources, but most especially to the donors that have helped me, and with some of these donors, they've been around for 20 years or even a little more, so very loyal donors supporting all of this work. My family, thank you for putting up with my obsessive work and travel schedule. I'm sorry I wasn't always around for you, Kelsey, but I love you. And Remy once asked me when I was tucking him into bed if I loved my computer more than him. No, honey, I don't, but I can see why it might look that way. Just saying. And then last but not least, I want to dedicate this to the elephants that got it all started from the beginning. And especially Shanti and Ambika, who are the two most studied elephants in the world, hands down, and were such an important part of my life for 35 years. I learned so much from them and was just so proud to be in their herd with them and their keepers. We lost them in 2020. So, yeah, I'm missing them a lot. But they were so important to everything. And I would say, the vast majority of what we know about elephants today really kind of boils down to these girls. So, thank you, Shanti and Ambika, and Tony, and Nancy, and I will see you in heaven someday. So that's it. Sorry, I think I may have run over, but if there may be some times for questions or whatever, happy to do that. That's it. And I was so good, you have no questions. Jill.
How do they guide the elephants without, sorry. How do they guide the elephants without?
Oh, so, I mean, it literally has a hook. And so if you want an elephant to move his foot, you would put the hook and you would just sort of pull, and he would do that. Or you would put it behind the ear and you would put it this way.
And what if they don't use a hook?
Well, then you train with verbal command, or you train with a training pole as a ball, which is what we're getting, which is what everybody's going to now. We really are trying to get away from that sharp anchor, because they can learn to come to a pole that just has a little ball at the end of it. So that's positive reinforcement training, and I meant to mention that in my talk, and I forgot. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it's called positive reinforcement training. So it is using verbal commands and then these target poles. And then you can, if you put a target pole by their foot, then they will learn to lift it. So it's a completely, less punitive way of training animals.
I have a question. Do African elephants and Asian elephants have the same cycle?
Oh, that's a very good question. For the most part, they do. What they differ in, a glaring difference is how prolactin works in Asian versus African. So the prolactin is actually responsible for some ovarian cycle problems with hyperprolactinemia. And we don't see that with Asian elephants. So we've never had a hyperprolactinemic Asian elephant. And the prolactin actually cycles during the ovarian cycle. So it's gonna go up during the follicular phase and low during the luteal phase, and that does not happen in Asians as well, so. Yeah, and the LH surge can sometimes look a little wonky in Africans compared to Asians. So there are these little subtle differences between the two, for sure. Peter. Yeah, I debated putting the COVID thing in but it would take another half hour. So, so yeah, we'd been collecting samples, we've been doing behavior evaluations for about 7 years, I suppose. So we had an enormous amount of baseline data on these elephants. And then when COVID hit, international travel stopped and all of the camps closed. They literally all closed. Nobody could even drive around the country. So now we had all these elephants with nothing to do. So some mahouts took them back to their villages where they would just end up being tied next to a house. Some of them stayed at the camps, but we did another survey. We did a survey for 2 years during COVID, starting in 2020, right as it was getting started. And so yeah, it's discouraging because I'm worried about elephants chained for 11 to 15 hours. Well, during COVID, some of them were chained for 48 hours. And so most of them were chained for almost 24 hours a day. And they may be unchained to go take a quick bath, and then that was about it. So we measured, so we looked at the stress hormones. There are some stress markers that showed that they were getting more stressed as the pandemic went on. We were trying to develop some muscle function assays because I want to see whether they had any kind of muscle wasting, so I need to do a little more digging on that. Their body condition did go down. So instead of being obese, they actually got down to a 3, which is normal. So maybe that was the silver lining because they didn't have so many bananas and sugar cane. They were actually getting to a normal weight. And so we're now looking at metabolic function in relation to that. And that's looking better as well. So really tricky. And so our hope is to really take a deep dive. My student has published the survey paper of that already, but now she's working on the physiological marker parts of it. And I'm really hoping that we can tease apart all these different camps and see if we can find some camps that were maybe doing it right. And we can use them as models to convince other places that, okay, look at this camp. They were still able to give baths every day. They were still able to walk animals around their camp area, and you can do it too. And if you do those things, they're gonna be much more healthy than if you just chain them up 24 hours a day. Oh, yes.
Would you please offer any comment to the recent documentary about elephants that received an Oscar? It's a short documentary of the Indian elephant that was adopted by a family. So I'm wondering whether it's real, it's romantic, it's a good story, or just something the movie makers make. Thank you.
Yeah, I believe it's real. Yeah, Elephant Whisperers, that was very touching. And it doesn't surprise me that he would be asked to take care of an elephant, and then he gets it all nice and ready to go, and then it gets taken away from him, because then they're gonna take it for training and maybe use them for patrols or something like that. But no, and I talked a little bit about the mahout culture, and that's what you're seeing there is real mahout culture, that they care for these elephants and they're their lives. And I think that we're losing a little bit of that in that how many people like that man and woman, how many people out there are able to spend that kind of time and commitment and something to elephants. And so I'm a little worried we're maybe losing people that can do that. But I found it to be a very touching story, and it was very realistic because the little elephant did end up having to leave, and that's the way that works. So I think they did a really nice job on it.
Do you have any plans for ongoing research into chronic health problems from long-term obesity in elephants?
Well, we're just continuing to gather data. I guess my graduate student, Carrie Moorfeld, she was the first one that we started looking at the obesity, and that was probably maybe only 10 years ago. So I just don't think, I think it's gonna take decades. of monitoring, fat elephants for a long period of time. We do have data, obviously, if you can take a fat elephant and exercise it and have it get down to normal, that the metabolic markers will follow suit. What we don't know, though, I will admit, is, well, is high insulin, really gonna cause a major problem? I mean, do they get diabetes? We don't even know if elephants get diabetes. Or do they get insulin resistance? And so we're trying to do some of those projects as well, and especially monitor animals that are going through a change in diet, so we can look at changes in body condition. But yeah, I think we're probably, I don't know, a good decade away before we really, I mean, elephants they can live to be 80, certainly 60. And so and even in women, the effects of obesity on humans takes decades. So it's not going to probably be a simple answer. But we do certainly have short-term data that show if you alter body condition, you're altering your metabolic state. And that fits with other species then. So we're kind of extrapolating to other species that it is an issue.
Thank you. A fascinating presentation, Janine. I have a question. When I lived in Thailand, elephant endothelial herpes virus was a disease I frequently encountered. And just randomly, my second year there, one of our elephant professors said that this normally happens, we called it the EHV storm. It normally happens after the rainy season. So I'm curious, did you see any increase or decrease in the stress biomarkers that you were measuring related to the seasons over there in Thailand?
That's a good question. We see changes in the cortisol relative to season when it's highest during the tourist season. It's not the rainy season, though. That's the December, January, Aziz, and so we could never tease apart whether the high cortisol was due to tourists or whether it was due to the climate, except now we have COVID. And the elephants that have been tracked through that 2-year COVID period, actually, I'm not seeing a seasonal effect in their cortisol. So we're gonna tease that part a little bit more, but that was like a perfect experiment, right? Because we always wanted to know, could we ever tease this apart? And now we did. So we're taking a deep dive into looking at that. That's part of the student's paper that she's still working on, but yeah. and as far as EEHV is concerned, I think I remember one of Kajanpat's papers not finding a real clear seasonality to the disease. But we are playing around with a little bit of hormone work. We do sometimes see the cortisol and some of the stress markers are changing a little bit before the symptoms start to come. In addition, we just did a paper on oxidative stress markers and stuff, so that'll be coming out pretty soon. We're trying to come up with other biomarkers that can give us an idea of, maybe predict what the risk of something is gonna be, or like a premonition, or, if we measure these, is it gonna give us an idea that something bad is happening, down the line? So like with EEHV, the platelet counts drop, and that'll happen before the calf actually shows physical symptom or signs. So if you can have these, I'm not being very articulate, but if you can have these biomarkers that give you like an early warning that something bad is happening, but that you can see with those biomarkers. So those are always the kind of things that and any ideas that you want to throw at us, we'll look at it, definitely.
Thank you. I don't have any ideas for biomarkers, unfortunately. I noticed when you brought your map up of your collaborations, most of them presumably are working on Asian elephants. What is happening with African elephants? Is there a similar map of collaboration?
Not to that extent, but we are working in Africa. So we're working with the Impala Research Center in Kenya. And so my technician, Nikki, just helped them set up an endocrine lab several years ago. So we do have an endocrine lab in Kenya. It's the only one that we've established in Africa so far. There are actually a couple of really good endocrinologists in Africa. So, we don't want to be stepping on toes and that sort of thing. But we are looking at elephants, obviously, trying to look at anthropomorphic activities and how that's impacting their stress levels, and then how climate change and vegetation index and stuff are related to all of those factors. So yeah, we have a small footprint in Africa.
We have time for one more question if anybody wants to close it out.
Well, you better make it my director.
You know, I think the solution, you're talking about the elephants in Asia, and a lot of people would be like, well, just stop having elephants in camp, you know, just end it. And I love how you talk about how you're helping them. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of Asian elephants culturally, economically, even as part of the overall conservation strategy?
Yeah, well, and you know, maybe I can almost do it as a two-prong, because people when I was just doing zoo elephants, people would ask me the same question, you know, why are you working on zoo elephants? But you know, these animals under human care, they do have roles to play in the conservation picture. And so, you know, our elephants educate the public about what the threats are for animals in the wild. Well, they're doing the same sorts of things in Asia, kind of ramped up even more, because yeah, elephants are the national symbol of Thailand, and I think they are for a couple of other countries. They are absolutely revered religiously, and they are, you know, in the shape of gods that people give, whatever the word is. So they're very important, very culturally important. And then in Thailand, they do make money economically. And so I have struggled off and on, should I even be supporting captive animals? But then on the other hand, there are captive animals because they do serve these roles. And so they're not going to go away just because I decide not to study them. So then my idea is, they're there. I think they need some help. I know how to help, and so I am like throwing myself in 150% to try to make sure that anything that's under human care is going to have a good life. And then at the same time, we're working with camps. Part of our guidelines that we developed has a conservation messaging component to it. So it's like, you guys are going to have these elephants here. We want to see some conservation messaging. And there's a lot more conservation messaging out there now. And it's just getting more all the time. So, you know, I think it does sort of bring people together, you know, in general. And people, you know, come from all over the world to see these elephants in Thailand. And so if we can show them elephants that have really good welfare, so they're going to go away with a really happy feeling, and also learn something about elephants and elephant habitats and you know, what they can do to protect them, I think we're doing our job. If that answered your question.
So thank you very much, Janine, for that wonderful illustration of what it means to be able to communicate to a specialist, if non-specialist audience is so important for this award. And I want to thank all of you here and the people who have been watching or will watch through streaming for being part of this. And to say that within the next week or two, there will be the call going out for nominations for the 2022 and 23 version of this award, the Distinguished Scholar in the Humanities. There'll be later in the year another call for sciences. But many of you seem to be scientists here, but please do think, if you have in the back of your mind, even thinking about that later call, who among your colleagues can exemplify this very important, central, and also wonderful part of the Smithsonian that we've been able to see through Janine's talk today. And I also wanted to just take a moment in closing to thank all of those administrators from the secretary on down at all of our bureaus who devote their lives to making it possible for this kind of research to go forward, because of course that not only fulfills the Smithsonian mandate, but also gives us all, I think, a better and deeper understanding of, as we've seen today, our relationship to nature and our place in the physical universe, and also a more nuanced understanding of mankind's history and many, many cultures. There is going to be a reception upstairs in the 4th floor in the patrons lounge, and if you just take an elevator, you'll be guided into that. So I invite you all to go there. With the exception of the previous winners and the family and Secretary Bunch, we'll have some photo opportunities here, and then we'll join you upstairs. Thank you very much. Thank you.